Okay, so welcome to this next lecture in our lecture series on religious traditions of India. For the people who are following online, if you want to, if you have some comments or some questions, we are using the app called Slido. It's an app you can download on a smartphone or a tablet, or you can just surf to the website slido.com, and then you enter the number that is 657919, and that will bring you to a chat where you can ask questions to our speaker. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Marie-Hélène Gorisse. I consider her a local. So about her background, she received her PhD from the University of Lille in philosophy, working on a text by a Digambara philosopher called Prabhachandra. The text was called Prameya Kamala Martanda. And after that, she came to Ghent University, and she's been working here for many years now, in varying capacities as a postdoc researcher and also as a visiting professor. In between, she's also been a Honda Fellow in Leiden and a teaching fellow also at SOAS in London, where she's taught Jainism and also modern Indian philosophy. But right now, she is employed in the Global Philosophy of Religion project that is housed at the University of Birmingham. And for those of you who do not know her, her expertises include Jainism and South Asian epistemology, hermeneutics, and theories of argumentation. So, Marie-Hélène, I give the mic to you.
Just like this, yeah. Okay, that will be maybe easier this way. Okay, so can you hear me well? Yes, good. So as most of you know, and as Eva just said, I'm specialized in theories of knowledge in Jainism. So can we acquire new knowledge through reasoning, through the correct interpretation of sacred text? Can we solve the deep disagreements that exist between the different schools by a regulated use of the rules of debate, or by distinguishing different types of epistemic attitudes in each concurrent school? All these sort of questions, as they appear in systematic treatises developed from Siddhasena's, Mahamati's Guide to Reasoning in the 8th century, or Akalanka's short treatises at the same period approximately. But while I was noticing the coexistence of several and at times conflicting conceptions in these more systematic treatises, I felt the need to do some digging in the developments of earlier Jain textual traditions. Notably the Jain canon, the commentarial tradition around Umasvati, and that of Kunda Kunda. And for today's lecture, I have been playing with one work of the later of Kunda Kunda, namely the Samayasāra, the essence of the self. And from this perspective of aiming at a better understanding of Jain later theories of knowledge, and this, I hope, will also give us a new perspective to look at the backbones of Kunda Kunda's text that will enable us to assess his inputs in Jain ways to conceive the relationship between the self and the world, as well as the proper behavior we all should take as innately all-knowing selves. So Kunda Kunda is actually not a single author, but more likely, it is the name that stands for the collective authorship of a textual tradition written in Prakrit. In the philosophy of mind of Kunda Kunda and Umasvati, Balcerovich tells us that the works of this textual tradition were composed, compiled, and expanded on over a span of a few centuries between the late 3rd and the 8th centuries, somewhere in Karnataka and adjacent regions. Now, this textual tradition represents within Jainism a movement that focuses on the self. In such a conception, what is central is the inward experience that is self-knowledge. This leads Kunda Kunda in his Essence of the Self to claim that what matters within one's spiritual quest is not primarily to follow the practices usually associated with Jainism, that is, to be restrained and careful of other living beings when one acts, speaks or thinks, nor to endure the hardships of hunger, bite, heat, nudity, sikkim alms and the like, nor to practice the reflections on impermanence, the penances, the reverences, the services, nor to study the scriptures. According to Kunda Kunda, those practices can be followed, but should never be taken as central. I quote, "It should be known that right knowledge is of the Ayaranga Sutta and other scriptures." So, yeah. It should be known that right knowledge is of the Ayaranga Sutta and other scriptures. Right faith is of the self and other categories, and right conduct is the protection of the 6 types of living beings. All these hold from the conventional perspective, Vyavahara. So not from the ultimate perspective, as we will see. But already, can you imagine a Jain teaching that the protection of living beings is to be considered from a conventional perspective? Besides, Kunda Kunda means it in a strong way. When later on he depicts in more detail the duties, he says, repentance, pursuit of the good, rejection of the evil, concentration, non-attachment to objects, self-censure, confession and purification by expiation. These 8 are the pot of poison. So, is this all a breach from tradition? We are going to see in what sense he means that. All the practices usually associated with Jainism seems to be dismissed and reassessed at but a step in a process whose real goal is to have a proper knowledge of the self. Whereas the self is my right knowledge, the self is my right faith, the self is my right conduct, the self is renunciation, the self is stoppage of karmas and yogic meditation. Interestingly enough, the title of this work uses the expression samaya, traditionally understood as a conventional practice or doctrinal points, as meaning the self. And by the way, other expressions that denote the self in the Samayasāra are jiva and atman. So, no, is such a conception unique in Jainism? Well, Kunda Kunda wants us to realize that in early Jainism, Mahavira did advocate meditative practices focused around the self next to rigorous asceticism. And that with time, the teaching of Mahavira based on experience evolved into more institutional forms, especially since Jainism is such an arduous path to undertake. Henceforth, there is a natural tendency to multiply the tools to facilitate the attainment of its goal. This is the main aspect of the criticism voiced by Kunda Kunda's textual tradition, criticizing an excess in the ritualistic focus and appealing to a proper knowledge of the self. This is not a rebellion, but an attitude closer to original Jainism. This stance will particularly be influential for later mystic trends. Mystic figures like Taransvami or Srimad Rajachandra claim to be in the lineage of Kunda Kunda. So for a tradition like Jainism, mysticism takes the form of direct personal experience of the divine within us, of our liberated self, which is a divine spark trapped in the empirical self. In other words, it is about a direct experience of what we really are, that is, a knowing self. Now, an inclination towards an inner experience of the self is actually also found in the seminal classical Tadvarta Sutra of Umasvamin, where meditation is introduced as the last tool in our fight against karmic bondage, and which is described as accessible only to the most advanced ascetics. And the highest parts of this meditation include concentration on the self. So, one last point to introduce before we properly start our investigations concerns this karmic bondage. In the Samayasāra, we can read that the activity, uvayoga, an essential characteristic of the self is consciousness. And that the non-self is absolutely different from this, and it has many subtypes. One of these is matter, in self having subtypes, one of these being kamma, so in Sanskrit karma. Since eternity, the self is associated with kamma, and from this association, modifications of consciousness happen. No, some of those kamma are delusive ones, moha, and 3 types of corrupt modification of consciousness happen, namely wrong faith, wrong knowledge, and wrong conduct. So for now, let us think of those modifications as like glasses which prevent from a good vision while leaving the sight faculty itself intact. This erroneous combination of the self and of non-self stuff that leaves the self intact constitutes what I will call the empirical self. Due to obscuring elements, the empirical self is sometimes blind with attachment, raga, raya, and this renders the situation worse since as food is digested by a person's gastric heat to produce flesh, fat, blood, and the like, this is via attachment that the kamma conditions are transformed to become the various kamma that bind the self, and that the kamma form on the self a karmic body that never becomes genuinely mixed with the self, I insist. So this rough summary of the bonding process in Kunda Kunda is useful to clarify the tight link that exists between soteriological practices and epistemology in Jainism, since withdrawing attachment equates acquiring uncorrupted modes of knowledge. And this is the reason why in another work, the Samayasāra, Kunda Kunda can claim that hunger, thirst, fear, anger, attachment, delusion, anxiety, old age, disease, death, perspiration, fatigue, pride, indulgence, surprise, sleep, birth, and restlessness. It is only 3 from all these defects that one is possessed with extreme power like omniscience and the like. This one is called the highest self. One who is contrary to this is not the highest self. So you see that a competency to overcome fear, anger, and the like is it is this what prompts epistemic competency. Besides, knowledge of the self is the means towards liberation in every sense of the word. It is the self that we have to know, and when doing so, it is the self who knows. So, Kunda Kunda's work is a soteriological manual. His main interest is to present the precise mechanisms by which we mistake the knowing self and karmic matter, as well as methods to overcome this unfortunate association. Yet, it is essentially linked with epistemological considerations, but not like the epistemological treatises which discuss the division between the modes of knowledge, pramana, and whose tradition is called Pramanavada. Indeed, the relevance of focusing on these traditional divisions is discarded within one verse in the Samayasāra. I quote, "Worldly knowledge, testimonial knowledge, cosmic knowledge, mental knowledge, and absolute knowledge are as one. This is this highest truth that once realized leads to liberation." So here Kunda Kunda is clear on the fact that it does not matter to distinguish the modalities through which we know, since what matters is to realize that irrespective of its subtypes, genuine knowledge is a manifestation of the essence of the self. However, the one who still needs to rely on the traditional classification of types of knowledge to reassess the current teaching is welcome to do so, since in virtue of its true essence, this teaching will not be judged faulty, whatever the checking method is. So the unity of the self differentiated from the non-self, I will describe it in its essential manifestation as much as I can. Consider it as knowledge, pamana. If I deviate, get rid of this erroneous conception. In other words, Kunda Kunda's teaching on the self goes beyond what we can tell or understand through mundane modes of knowledge. But mundane modes of knowledge within their respective domains still agree with it. So in the Samayasāra, the 2 above-mentioned verses are the only one referring to the traditional modes of knowledge, pamana. Following Kunda Kunda leads, we should understand that what is central is not the investigation of this pamana, but rather that of nanna, the highest knowledge, understood as discriminative knowledge, which refers to the ability to distinguish what matters and what does not, and which stems from the practices of karma burning. In 2 other texts of Kunda Kunda, so the Pravachanasara and the Panchatika Samagaho, he introduces pure knowledge, impure knowledge, auspicious knowledge, and each of them are described according to the amount of karmic matter destroyed. So pure knowledge is when the karmic matter on the self is totally destroyed, impure when the self is still polluted, and auspicious knowledge when, although polluted, the self is under the influence of righteousness. So again, what matters in the types of knowledge when there are the ways in which they are mixed or not with karma, nothing else. No, there are beings who have realized the pure unobstructed knowledge. These beings are unobstructed knowledge. They conform with their realized omniscient self. And their existence and activity is important for other points of discussion in our epistemological digging. Indeed, some of those beings have been teaching. This is how the Jain canon was formed. No, the fact that a teaching has been uttered by one of these omniscient beings is sufficient for it to be valid. This method of validation is used thoroughly in the Samayasāra, as is already manifest in the opening verse. So, I will tell this offering on the self which has been uttered by the ones who know all scripture. So this qualification, this teaching has been uttered by the ones who know all scripture is something that will happen again and again for of the treaties. But before we draw any conclusion from quotes like this one, it is important to understand that these beings who know all scriptures are quite different from someone who would simply be well-versed in the Jain literary tradition, canonical tradition. Indeed, in Digambara Jainism, the expression those who know the scriptures refer to the direct disciples of Mahavira, of which Sudarman is the last one and who reached omniscience. After this, the transmission of Mahavira's teaching gradually declines up to Dharasena, the 33rd teacher in succession to the disciple Gautama, and the last one to know one full body of text from the canon. So in this picture, the genuine knowers of the whole scriptures are omniscient. And this omniscience is a condition of possibility for their genuine knowledge of the scriptures. So Kunda Kunda makes sure that there is no doubt concerning this criterion when it specifies that certainly the one who experiences attachment and the like, even in only one atom, does not know the self, even if he is well versed in all the scripture. Then the self who is not predestined, even if he has studied excellently, the scriptures does not liberate from non-self stuff. Like a snake drinking milk does not become devoid of poison. So the important issue here is actually not to be well versed in the scriptures, but it is that the scriptures that emanate from the unobstructed consciousness of omniscient beings can in turn be fully grasped only by similar beings, by omniscient beings. So the constant appeal to revert figures is a central mode of validation in the Samayasāra. These validating beings are mentioned in various ways. So I'm quoting a few of them here. They are called the Jina, 23 mentions of the Jinas to validate a claim of Kunda Kunda. The Jina said that, the Jina said that. You have the omniscient ones, the ones who know all scriptures, the seers who are the light of the world, the sages who have certitude, those who know ultimate reality, those who know certainty, etc. First, this type of presentation is very much in line with the classical theories of meditation, since Umasvati presents the first variety of meditation as belonging to the one conversant with the early scriptures. And he presents the last two variety of meditation as the one belonging to the omniscient ones. Secondly, it is noticeable that Kunda's approach is not an isolated one. We just have to remember that in epistemological treatises, it is very frequent that the liberating being of each tradition, or the omniscient being of each tradition, Buddha, Kapila, Mahavira, is regularly recognized as a means of validation. But Kunda's approach, as we will see, goes one step further, since it is also an inner means. And third, this enables Kunda to present his teaching not as an original teaching, but as the reassessment of the original teaching of the Jain masters. So this link really has to be strong enough because it has to ensure a good reception of this uncompromising criticism of rituals, which, let's not forget, are no less than the practices of revered monks of the time. Now, something else that interests me here is that Kunda Kunda links all this to the knowledge of the self. So whoever realizes the absolute and pure nature of this self through the knowledge of the scriptures, the seer who are the light of the world, called him an omniscient one who knows all scripture. So actually the one who knows all scriptures, the one who is omniscient, is the one actually who has a good knowledge of his self. The Jinas call him an omniscient one who knows all scripture, as all scriptural knowledge leads to the knowledge of the self. Therefore, the knower of the self is called he who knows all scriptures. So you see how omniscience has a double function here, as we also already indicated a bit. In Johnson's words, on one hand, we have the objective pre-moksha omniscience of the Jina, the validator of the teaching and of the taxonomy. And on the other hand, we have the subjective innate omniscience of the self, which is rooted in a basic categorical distinction between self and non-self. This subjective omniscience is, moreover, self-validating, insofar as it can be tasted individually and experientially. So, yeah, validating omniscience of the Jinas and validating omniscience of my inner self when I will, unobstruct it from all the karmic matter. So to sum up, omniscience. So omniscience has an epistemic ability that is reached thanks to the burning of karma, and that is linked with Jain meditative practices. This omniscience is what ensures the validity of both knowledge through the Jain teaching and knowledge through direct knowledge of the self. Besides, it is the only way to properly characterize the self and other inaccessible phenomena of soteriological prime relevance. And here, Kunda Kunda's most untraditional move is probably the following one. So, know that the self is without taste, without form, without odor, not palpable, with the quality of consciousness, without sound, and not knowable by any inferential evidence, and without a definite manifestation. In these verses, we are taught that for mundane beings, inferential reasoning is unavailable. This is why the only access to what there is learning from an omniscient. So learning from an omniscient means either from revelation in scriptures, but this is only achievable for someone similar, so himself omniscient, or from self-knowledge of an omniscient within us, in a meditative-like stance. So you can see why Kunda Kunda's teaching had a huge success in later mystic trends, since it consists in a self-surrendering to God's disposition to the divine, a disposition to openness to a higher order of being within us. So this stance stands in opposition with the analytic approach. While the analytic approach consists in reconstructing the whole picture by assembling its smaller elements, Kunda has a holistic approach to reality that consists in recognizing the value of elements only from the perspective of someone who has already grasped the entire picture. So we also understand why, even in Umasvati, meditative practices were to introduce only for the more advanced ones. So as stated in the famous verse of the Ayaranga Sutra, he who knows one knows all. He who knows all knows one. Yet, since the whole grasp is not accessible to all, and since the Samayasāra is also a pedagogical manual, Kunda Kunda will also take the analytical perspective, so to speak, from time to time. However, he will not use this approach to characterize the self itself, but to characterize those very elements which are especially the intricate mechanism of causality and the ways by which karma is taken to be linked with the self. Okay, so also Kunda Kunda is in opposition with its proximate other, Samkhya here, because the whole edifice of Samkhya philosophy, as you know, relies on the fact that although the self is inaccessible to the senses, it is possible by means of inference and reasoning to distinguish each of the soteriologically relevant categories, and to acquire a proper salutary knowledge of the self. So inferential reasoning is so essential that in the Samkhya Karika, mastering it is the characteristic mark of the Samkhya conception of the world. By opposition to people relying on perception on scriptures. So I will skip Samkhya because it's not a matter today, but I just want you to remember that in Samkhya, this is thanks to inference that we know the three soteriologically relevant categories, which are the self, the unmanifested non-self, and the manifested non-self. Purusha, Prakriti, and manifested Prakriti. But while Jain philosophers also recognize a similar distinction between self and non-self, there is nothing like an unmanifested non-self that would act as an intermediate to know the self. However, there is another type of very different in nature, but there is also an intermediary between the self and the non-self in Jainism, which are the modifications of consciousness. And those will be very useful in order to know the activity of the self thanks to inferential reasoning in some very definite parts of the Samayasāra. Okay, indeed, in the Samayasāra, it seems that the modification of consciousness, which can be seen as the activity or essential characteristics of the empirical self, function as an intermediary between the uncorrupted consciousness of the self and the Kamma, part of the non-self self. And so as such, they are very useful to use inferential reasoning on causal relationships in order to know more about the activity of the self and on the reasons why it appears as bonded, even though it is not in reality. So in this dynamic, some sections of the Samayasāra, like the 5th chapter on bondage, offer developed mechanic theories of the types of association between those principles. Yeah, it's maybe a bit little. So the self is not an effect because it is produced by anything whatever. It is not produced by anything whatever, nor it is a cause because it does not produce anything whatever. The manifested effect conditions the nature of the manifesting agent, and similarly, the manifesting agent determines the nature of effects. This is the principle of causation that is observed to operate in the world of reality, and no other principle is evident. The self is born and dies because of the operation of Kamma. Similarly, Kamma as conditioned by the self appears and disappears. Thus, the association of the two, the self and the Kamma, is brought about by their mutual determination as the instrumental cause. Thus, by them, the cycle of birth and death is produced. So in other words, Kunda Kunda also recognizes the epistemological importance of inference from causation, but in a part of the Samayasāra which focuses on the empirical self, who thinks he is limited and part of causal processes, not in part of the Samayasāra which focuses on the unobstructed self. Interestingly enough, this theory of causation contains implicit references to the Bhagavad Gita, whose teachings are partially close to that of the Samkhya. This is most obvious, for example, in the following verses. He who thinks I kill and I am killed by other beings, he is an ignorant fool. But the one who knows thinks otherwise. The one who knows, engaged in and taking the nature of the non-self stuff, enjoys the fruits of Kamma. But the knower, knowing the fruits of Kamma, does not experience them when they arise. So, in the conception of both the Bhagavad Gita and of Kunda Kunda, so the self is not the empirical self, but a permanent pure consciousness. The acts of the empirical self are determined by the karmic network, and the empirical self should stop desiring the consequences of his acts. But besides this substantial common feature, the two conceptions are radically different. And the teaching transmitted by means of verses such as the one above is not that of the Bhagavad Gita. So more precisely, from the Bhagavad Gita perspective, not being killed means that the permanent self is not killed when the empirical self is. And the teaching is that one should not stop acting. One has to act in a dharmic way for the preservation of a better manifestation of the universe, so to speak. That is to say, one should not desire any given consequences of his acts for himself. Empirical selves are but one manifestation of the universal spirit that presides over the fruition of karma. But from Kunda's perspective, not being killed means that in truth, the empirical self is not killed by external factor, like a gun or the like, but he is killed in virtue of the fruition of its life karma. So it's really because of this fruition of the life karma that he is killed. And the teaching is that what matters is not to act in a specific way in the karmic network. What matters is that you understand how different from this network you are as a self, as an unobstructed self. And so from these observations, it is also clearer why causal inferences do not matter in the same way in both works. So, continuing on the status and function of knowledge in the Samayasāra, I would like to review the means by which less advanced people, like let's face it, you and me, can learn. That is to say, how Kunda teaches us. So, first, the teaching of Kunda is made thanks to an abundance of metaphors. He repeats metaphor after metaphor, especially on the relationship between the self and karma, and also on the nature and function of the self. So he especially tells us that the self and karma is like a crystal and a red object reflected on it. So this metaphor is the most well-known, I think, and to be found in many traditions. With the pun that the Prakrit term raya means both red object and attachment. So I am reading him as surely as a pure crystal does not turn red, etc. by itself, but is colored by another red substance, so truly the pure knower does not become impassioned by himself, but and by another impassionate, etc. disease. So you see, in its true essence, the self is unaffected by karmic modification. So very briefly, you have other metaphors that you can find in the Samayasāra. The main one are that the self and non-self stuff are said to be related like gold and other metals, or like the artisan and his work, or like a king and his subject. Yes, for example, when you say the king has arrived, when there is a whole procession with hundreds of people, of course, the king is only part of it, more than the king has arrived. The artisan is both identical with his work because he puts intention in it, and is also very different because the potter is not the pot. Or gold and other metals, those metaphors are used for many different types of argument, but one of that is that they form a unit when gold and iron are united, but still they don't mix with one another. You still have gold at some point and iron at another point. Or also that in mud, gold remains gold because it's non-adhesive, but iron is very adhesive. So it is more polluted inside. The last metaphor is the chalk and the wall. So the chalk whitens the wall by its whiteness, but it does not become wall and the like. So all these metaphors have one common goal. It is to make us realize that self and karma are indeed always seen together and interacting and working together, but that the self is not really bound to karma. It's always pure, unobstructed, pure knowledge in the end. And next to these metaphors, the second well-known method of Kunda to express these intricate relationships is to distinguish between two levels of characterization. The one is the ultimate perspective, and the conventional perspective. So, all these states of modification of consciousness and the like are the self. This is uttered by the best of the Jainas as a teaching from the conventional perspective. When the multitude of royal soldiers is seen, it is said that the king has appeared, but it is uttered from the conventional perspective. For there is only one king who made an appearance in this case. In the same way, it is said that in the scriptures that the modifications of consciousness and other states of the like are the self. But this is from the conventional perspective. For there is only one unified and isolated self from the ultimate perspective. So, as has been noticed elsewhere, there is no one single doctrine of perspectives in the Samayasāra, but at least two contradictory ones. More precisely, in most of the treatises, the conventional perspective is plainly wrong and cannot be taken as a pedagogical tool. It's plainly wrong, but it can be taken as a pedagogical tool, but not always for the less advanced souls, while the ultimate perspective is the only one that genuinely refers to a state of the world. So as is the case with the metaphor of about the relationship between the crystal and its coloration. The crystal is not really red. However, when it comes to passages dealing with another well-known Jain theory, the theory of viewpoints, Nayavada, and the refutation of other schools, the distinction between both perspectives takes another meaning. There, the conventional perspective has a call to correctness, as it provides a partial truth. And this can be seen, for example, in the metaphor about the relationship between the artisan and his work. On one perspective, he does not become identical with its spot, but on another one, he is one with his own effort and intention. So when this later interpretation of the doctrine of two perspectives in Kunda Kunda is taken, there is actually a vocabulary shift, because now we start to speak about one-sided views, Eyanta or modes, Pajaya, and their substantial counterparts. And so an explanation of this state of affair is that the viewpoint meaning of Kunda Kunda's two perspectives theory was part of a later layer of this textual tradition. There are a lot of different chronological layers in this text, which seems as being one, but actually multiple layers. And the Jain theory of viewpoint appear in the later of them. It was used for different purposes at different periods, this theory of viewpoint, but always to solve an aporia related to the problem of the one and the many. So, especially Jain philosophers who developed the theory of viewpoint are concerned with the possibility for the self to consist in origin, persistence, and decay. Also for the possibility for the self to be knowing yet permanent, because when you know, you are subject to modifications, or for the possibility for the self to be both substance and mode, particular and universal in different aspects of it. And by the 7th century, when there was the need to refute the theories of other traditions to protect the Jain one, the theory of viewpoint became a way of presenting non-Jain traditions, especially since Samantabhadra's investigation on authority, Haptabhimamsa. So, and this is what happens actually in the later layers of the Samayasāra, where there is the need to face Buddhist philosophers and claim that the self does not have to be radically impermanent in order to endeavor modifications, because the substance persists through its modes, so self can be both permanent and have modifications of consciousness caused by kamma, and also to face from the philosophers from the Samkhya tradition. So let's spend 5 minutes on this, and then we will get to the conclusion. So one of the main innovations in Kunda Kunda's line on thinking is the claim according to which the self is not genuinely bound with karmic matter. And in his paper Kunda Kunda and Samkhya and the Soul, Johannes Bronkhorst remarks that Kunda Kunda's project might be thought of in terms of an attempt to bring into Jain philosophy an idea that has been very fertile in other systems, namely the idea of an essentially inactive self. So to explain, if all activity is performed by non-self stuff, it means that in reality, the self itself has never acted. So therefore, proper knowledge of the self amounts to the realization that one has never genuinely been bound by kamma. And so you see that this realization alone is sufficient to free us from rebirth and karmic retribution. No other knowledge is needed, only this knowledge of what the real self is. So now in Jainism too, liberation could seem to lie in inactivity, since what binds the self with kamma are the acts. Besides, the idea of a freeing knowledge is well present in Kunda Kunda, as we have seen, and as the following verses make explicit, because it is only in a metaphorical way that the acts of the self can be said to produce kamma. And the self that is full of ignorance, mistaking the non-self for the self, and the self for what is non-self, is the agent of kamma. But the soul which consists of knowledge, not mistaking the non-self for the self, or the self for the non-self, is not the agent of kamma. So this self who knows is not the agent of kamma. But despite all this, you all know that it is very important in Jainism that the self should be active. The idea of an inactive self is totally absent in Kunda Kunda's metaphysic. The soul is described as modified by modification of consciousness or states such as anger. So first, why is this active self so important for Kunda Kunda? We can argue that Jain metaphysics is primarily centered around soteriological questions and that only an active self could be a morally responsible subject as well as a responsible for its own liberation. But another line of answer, which is interesting, can be found in a paper by Anna Bijel, Kunda Kunda on Modal Modification. There it is shown that if we are to take seriously the Jain claim according to which there is no absolute permanence and no absolute change, then every self should be changing as well as having a type of persistence, which means even the omniscient ones. Even the omniscient one who fully manifests the qualities of consciousness, energy and bliss should not experience absolute permanence. Bijel shows that this conception is possible if we understand that the omniscient ones still have modal variations on their consciousness, so momentary and innately arising modes of absolute knowledge and of absolute consciousness continuously succeed to one another and are qualitatively identical. A bit as the innately produced modes of time are qualitatively identical to one another. So, building on this reflection, I would like to suggest that besides this requirement of an active self, there is another important conception in Jaina philosophy that accounts for the differences between the Samayasāra and the views exposed in the Samkhya-Karika in relation to the determination of the method toward liberation. So indeed, the Samkhya-Karika describes a situation of confusion between what is the knower and what is the object of cognition. You see, when we look at ourselves in a mirror, we think we see our face, but what we actually see is a reflect of ourselves. And in a very similar way, when we know the self, what we actually know is not the self as a subject of knowledge, but the self as an object and knowledge. The problem is that the real self is not anything else than a subject of knowledge. So we plainly miss the point and the purpose if we know the self as an object of knowledge. So in this type of situation, it seems that the only possible awareness of the self should be a type of self-enjoyment, since no intentional knowledge, that is to say, no knowledge of an object, can be proper for this. And in such a system, renunciation and equanimity are central because intentionality, intentional knowledge also, are desires, are knowledge of something else. We alienate ourselves in something which is limited, therefore which is not us, and we become dependent upon alien determining conditions. So all this might help us to try and understand what is going on in the Samayasāra, because even though it seems that something very similar happens in Kunda Kunda, there are essential differences. First, the teaching of the Samayasāra is not about situation in which knower and object of knowledge should be distinguished, but it is to prevent from situation in which the knower is distinguished from the cognition itself. The knower is the cognition. There is no difference here. So it's on the slide. Since it always knows, the self is the one who knows, the knower, and it should be known that knowledge is not different from the knower. Such a phrasing points to the fact that we should not say that the self has complete knowledge, but that it is complete knowledge. Indeed, the perfect knowing self is also himself knowledge. At the stage of perfection, the knower fully becomes a cognition per se, regaining its true cognitive essence. So one consequence of this conception is that correct knowledge of the self is experience of the self. But this has to be understood in a very different way than the Brahmanic consciousness as enjoyment. Indeed, in Jainism, we seek a self who is knowledge itself and bliss and existence, but this knowledge as enjoyment is not the changeless absolute consciousness of Samkhya Yoga. Because the changeless absolute consciousness of Samkhya Yoga is pure condition of possibility of consciousness without any content and also inactive. On the contrary, in Jainism, we seek an actualized consciousness able to change and with a content. Besides, in Jainism, the objects of knowledge exist totally independent from the knower. And despite this, it seems that there is no difference between knowledge of the self and knowledge of the world. Being unobstructed knowledge in the Jain conception really means knowing the knower with knowledge itself, which also entails to know the whole world, to be omniscient. This is, I would say, an intentional knowledge in act here. So, to conclude, let us address the soteriological consequences of such a reading. If proper cognition of the true nature of the self, which amounts to proper cognition of everything, is sufficient to become liberated, first, meditation and openness to one's inner self is indeed way more efficient a means like a lift to heaven. And an arduous practice of reasoning and acquiring step-by-step knowledge is actually not good enough to be even a stairway to heaven, if I may. Knowledge is not about epistemic categories, but about the burning of kamma. Second, what is the position of ascetic practices in this picture? In his paper, Jainism from Ontology to Taxonomy, the colonization of the universe, Johnson asked whether the verse, "He who knows one knows all, he who knows all knows one," is a description of the states of the jhana, or whether it can also be taken as a prescription to be followed by the one seeking liberation. And this questioning is crucial, because if this verse is taken as a prescription, which it probably should be, then it means that knowing the self is being the self. That is to say, becoming the omniscient we always were. So this is a type of Gnosticism, since to achieve salvation, one needs the direct experience of knowledge. But in such a situation in which knowledge is the only required soteriological tool, ascetic practices and non-violence appear as becoming superfluous, as stated in the Samayasāra, where the duties are equated to a pot of poison. But they are such only when they are mistaken for what is central. Indeed, the centrality of equanimity and the like as a preparatory practice is actually not threatened by a view according to which knowledge alone is salutary, since omniscience is a very special type of knowledge that requires a state of total renunciation for the burning of karmas. In this dynamic, both ascetic practices and a non-violent behavior are actually the surest means for us to acquire the right set of mind in order to be open to this type of knowledge. This is a proper stairway. And this is what manuals like the Samayasāra also achieve by means of these constant repetitions and metaphors and perspectives. So thank you for your attention.